Why did the Norway-Sweden Union collapse? What would happen if you smashed two countries together into one? It might make an ultra-powerful superstate, or more likely, it'll start a war. But when this exact thing happened with Norway and Sweden in the 19th century, the result was a strange multi-decade failure that both nations seem embarrassed to remember. In this video, we'll look at the oft-forgotten union of Sweden and Norway, and see how the odd attempts to bind them together crashed and burned in less than a century. The Swedish-Norwegian Union was born out of the reorganization of Europe following the defeat of Napoleon in the War of the Sixth Coalition. Denmark controlled Norway at the time and had allied with Napoleon. It agreed to surrender Norway to Sweden as punishment. The Swedes believed a united peninsula, along with Norway's extra men and resources, would be a valuable defensive move for the 19th century. Thus, the Union of Sweden and Norway was born in 1814. For the sake of this video, we don't need a full breakdown of how the Union worked. The basics are as follows. Norway and Sweden were joined under one crown and one flag. Foreign affairs and diplomacy were managed by Sweden, while both countries managed day-to-day politics by themselves. Norway still had a prime minister and a cabinet, and both countries retained their parliaments, the Riksdag for Sweden and the Storting for Norway. The Swedish king also had veto power over certain laws passed in Norway, and all Norwegian ministers had to be approved by him, though this was mostly a formality. However, despite their shared Nordic heritage, Sweden and Norway were quite different. For one, Norway had a much smaller population and was poorer. It was clear from the start that the union was not an equal one, with Sweden wielding control over Norway much more than the other way around. The inequality baked into the union was easy to notice. The union's monarchs were numbered based on Swedish chronology. Foreign affairs were managed by Swedes, and the Swedish king's veto power over Norwegian affairs was a symbol of the imbalance. Until 1830, Norwegian ships were even required to fly a Swedish flag, and afterwards, Norwegian flags on ships had to display the Union's insignia in the corner. One place that issues arose early was in the office of the Stadtholder. The Stadtholder was basically the king's deputy in Norway, acting in his authority when the king wasn't there. For the first 30 years, every single Stadtholder was Swedish, giving a Swede supreme power over Norwegian affairs. That changed in 1836 when Herman Vidal Jarlsberg became the first Norwegian Stadtholder, and all future Stadtholders would be Norwegian after him. However, this annoyed the Swedes, who now felt they had no say over Norwegian daily affairs when the king wasn't around. This was annoying, since Norway always had a minister in Stockholm to advocate for Norwegian interests in its daily affairs. In 1859, the Storting voted to abolish the office entirely. Although King Carl XV privately supported it, he didn't officially do so, and the Swedish Riksdag didn't approve the abolition either. In fact, Norway making a major constitutional change annoyed many Swedes. Count Carl Henrik Ankersvärd, for example, urged the king to amend the Acts of Union to rein in the Storting, saying that the prevailing spirit in Norway seems to be that Sweden is a kingdom united with Norway, but it is Norway that is united with Sweden. After leaving the office in limbo, King Oscar II agreed to support the abolishment of the Stadtholderate in 1872. The Riksdag scolded him for making a major change without asking them first, but ultimately agreed. Norway wasn't thrilled that it had to wait almost 2 decades for Sweden to listen to its demand, and they noticed how unhappy the Riksdag was when doing so. Another major area of disagreement was defense. The two big concerns for Scandinavia in the 19th century were Prussia, unified into Germany in 1871, and the Russian Empire. Denmark bordered the former, Sweden the latter, and the threat of both powers helped build a sense of Scandinavian solidarity. Indeed, Norwegian and Swedish volunteers fought shoulder to shoulder with the Danes in 1848 to put down a German rebellion in the Schleswig-Holstein region. But ultimately, Norway was far removed from Europe's conflicts and had a small military. They had no interest in getting involved in European wars. The Union also required the Storting to approve any use of Norwegian troops outside the kingdom, effectively giving it a veto over the king's military plans. In 1864, the Storting shot down King Carl V when he attempted to intervene in hostilities between Denmark on one side and Prussia and Austria-Hungary on the other, again over the Schleswig-Holstein region. This veto frustrated the king, and Denmark's ultimate defeat and loss of the Schleswig-Holstein region built resentment against the Norwegians in military circles that never quite faded. Probably the biggest problems that spelled doom for the Union were democracy and nationalism. The second half of the 19th century was one of democratic revolution and the birth of national identities across Europe. Norway and Sweden were not immune, and while they avoided outright revolution, there was an obvious swell of national identity after 1848 and growing calls for a democratic revolution to supplant the old political order. Norway was especially open to the democratic impulse, and it gained ground quickly. Norway's constitution was among the most democratic in Europe, and it inevitably came into conflict with the Union, designed mostly by old-school elites. The Storting gradually filled up with members who reflected this democratic impulse. By the 1870s, the working-class peasants faction and the faction of Johan Sverdrup, usually linked with the intelligentsia and educated classes, combined into a coalition urging democratic reform against the conservative pro-unionists. This democratic impulse went hand in hand with a rising sense of Norwegian nationalism. With a flourishing of books, plays, music, poetry, and other cultural output, Norwegian identity and culture was exploding. With this sense of self came a sense of pride that couldn't accept Swedish domination. The left faction began wielding their power in the Storting to take back control from the Swedish king. By the 1880s, there was practically a culture war in Norway between the radical anti-union democratic left and the conservative pro-union right. The Storting elections in 1882 saw Sverdrup's left coalition sweep into power, and throwing the future of the Union into doubt. How long could Sverdrup's democratic nationalists accept a conservative monarchical union with a foreign power? Fearful of a full-blown revolution, Oscar II reached out to fellow European rulers, including Bismarck of Germany, for advice. When word of this got out, Oscar was accused of seeking foreign help to oppress the Norwegians, and public opinion utterly prevented him from acting. Sweden was forced to accept the rebalancing of power, but by now, the tide of Norwegian nationalism couldn't be stopped. It was no longer a matter of if the Union would last, but for how long. There were two straws that finally broke the Union's back. The first was diplomacy. Basically, Sweden retained control over all of Norway's foreign relations. Norway instead wanted to appoint its own consulars to represent its interests. After all, it was a nation with interests like any other. It was also an issue of trade, with Norway's vast merchant marine fleet, far larger than Sweden's, giving it a big role in European trade, which Norway felt required them to wield more diplomatic power. Sweden refused to accept this. The disagreements went on for years, with negotiations about establishing a joint council to oversee foreign affairs breaking down in 1890. The second issue was defense. In 1885, Norway reduced its already low number of active troops. To the Swedes, who had entered the Union largely as a defensive move, this was a failure of Norway to uphold its promises. Norwegians, meanwhile, didn't want to be used as Swedish cannon fodder if the much-feared war with Germany or Russia ever came. Through the 1890s, these two issues caused relations between Norway and Sweden's leaders to collapse. Negotiations went nowhere, and both sides came to believe the other was threatening their interests. Sweden was oppressing Norway. Norway was failing in its promises to Sweden. Either way, both sides agreed the union wasn't working. The disagreement was so bad that there were rumors of a military solution. By 1900, Norway had ramped up its military spending, but used it to start building forts on the Swedish border. To the Swedes, who were investing men and resources fortifying the border with Russia to protect both themselves and Norway, it was a massive insult. Events dragged out for years, with negotiations failing to solve anything. In 1904, a final Swedish denial to back down on the consular issue proved to be the final insult. It was obvious to everyone that the Union had fallen apart. Returning from a final trip to Norway in March 1905, Crown Prince Gustav advised the king and the Riksdag that it'd be better for Sweden to just dissolve the Union now, rather than wait for Norway to do it. But the king was prevented by oath from doing so, and the Riksdag ignored him. A few weeks later, the Norwegian government voted to establish its own consular service in direct defiance of Sweden. The entire government resigned, and on June 7, 1905, the Storting voted to dissolve the Union. The king was deeply upset, but he was powerless to stop them. Regardless of how he felt, it was obvious that the people of Norway and Sweden were sick of the Union. Practically no one considered it to be worth the trouble to save. King Oscar and the Riksdag were forced to accept the dissolution, asking only that the Storting hold a public vote to confirm that it was the will of the people. With 367,149 votes to just 184, there was no mistaking that it was. Thankfully, Sweden and Norway's relationship recovered quickly. King Oscar II's granddaughter even married into the newly established Norwegian royal family in 1929, and today, the countries are close allies and friends. And so, the union of Sweden and Norway passed into history,